Welcome to our deep dive into the Black Death
Yes.
and its impact on this small village called Walsham.
Yeah.
We're going to be using some really fascinating sources today.
Yeah.
Historical records like manor court rolls, which are essentially the official village logs, along with academic studies and even personal stories from people who lived through this tumultuous time.
It's right.
It's like we're piecing together this puzzle,
Yeah.
from centuries ago.
Yeah. And it's amazing how all of these pieces come together
Right.
to create this vibrant picture of what Walsham was like before the plague hit.
Yeah.
Imagine a village of about 1,000 to 1,500 people, most of whom were working the land,
Wow.
growing wheat and barley,
Okay.
which were the staples for their, bread and ale. It was a
Yeah.
very tight-knit community. Everyone knew their neighbors' kids were running through the fields,
Oh,
families working side by side.
that sounds so peaceful.
Yeah.
But then the Black Death arrived.
Right.
How did this devastating plague even reach a place like Walsham?
Well, the plague swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351,
Okay.
and it was spread by fleas that lived on rats that were carrying this deadly bacteria.
Oh, yeah.
So think about it. A flea bites an infected rat, and then it bites a human,
Oh,
and the disease takes hold.
wow.
And it gets even more horrifying because there are actually 3 different types of plague.
3 types.
Yeah, bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic.
That's terrifying. What were the differences?
Okay, well, let's start with bubonic plague.
Okay.
That was the most common type.
Hmm.
It caused these swollen lumps called buboes, along with fever chills.
Oh, wow.
Then there was pneumonic plague,
Okay.
which attacked the lungs, causing terrible coughing and making it really hard to breathe.
Oh, gosh.
And finally, the most deadly form is septicemic plague.
Oh, my God.
This one infected the blood, and it was highly contagious,
Wow.
especially in crowded places.
So you can imagine how vulnerable a village like Walsham would have been. That's a grim thought.
Yeah.
And the manor court rolls, those village records we mentioned,
Right.
show that 119 tenants died in Walsham.
Yes.
But that number doesn't capture the true scale of the tragedy, does it?
Wow, it barely scratches the surface.
Wow.
When you consider families, the death toll likely reached 535 to 595 people.
Oh, my gosh.
Can you imagine that? Nearly half of the entire village wiped out in a very short span of time.
Wow.
The fear, the grief, the empty houses, a community torn apart.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that kind of loss.
Yeah.
And for those who survived, how did the Black Death change Walsham's economy? After all, if half your workforce is gone, things have to shift.
Exactly. Everything changes.
Right.
Before the plague, most people were farmers tied to the land working for the lord who owned it.
Okay.
And this system was called feudalism. Imagine a pyramid with the king at the top, then nobles, and at the bottom, the peasants working the land.
Right.
But suddenly, with so many people dead, the surviving workers, they had more power.
Oh, wow.
They could demand higher wages and better conditions from the lords who needed them to work the land.
So the Black Death, in a way, gave more power to the peasants.
Yeah.
That's a pretty unexpected consequence.
It really is. And this shift in power had a huge ripple effect.
Okay.
Think about it, with fewer mouths to feed, you need less land for crops.
Right.
And farmers started using more land for grazing sheep,
Okay.
which meant that wool production boomed,
Wow.
turning Walsham into a hub for this really valuable commodity.
Tragedy leading to opportunity. Do we have any specific examples of how this played out for individuals?
We do. The story of Matthew Gilbert illustrates this perfectly.
Why?
Before the plague, he was a small-time farmer.
Okay.
But then his wife and brother died, leaving him their land.
Oh, wow.
And with so much land available due to the plague, he was able to buy even more from the Lord at a low price.
Wow.
He used this land for sheep and became very wealthy.
Wow, that's quite a turn of events.
Yeah.
But Matthew's story is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
This economic upheaval must have shaken up the whole social order in Walsham.
Absolutely.
That feudal system we talked about, the lords at the top, peasants at the bottom, that must have been impacted, right?
Absolutely. Before the Black Death, the manor court, which was controlled by the Lord, had a huge influence on village life.
Right.
They profited from events like deaths and marriages,
Wow.
but the labor shortage gave farmers much more bargaining power,
Okay.
which led to higher wages and better conditions.
Right.
Imagine you're a peasant who suddenly has more leverage.
Yeah.
How would you feel about the government trying to cap your wages and keep things as they were before?
Yeah. I wouldn't like that.
Well, that's exactly what happened.
Really?
With the Statute of Laborers, a law designed to suppress wages and maintain the old order.
Wow.
Yeah,
That must cause some tension.
it did.
Did the statute work?
Not really.
Okay.
It mostly just angered people,
Right.
especially those who saw a chance for a better life. Some poor farmers were able to become landowners, build bigger homes, and even challenge the authority of the lords.
Wow.
It wasn't a sudden revolution,
Right.
but the cracks in the feudal system were starting to show.
So the Black Death didn't just change the economy, it shifted the balance of power as well.
Absolutely.
But what about people's faith?
Right.
How did the Black Death impact their beliefs?
Yeah.
Did it cause a spiritual crisis in Walsham?
It absolutely did. Before the plague Walsham, like most of Europe was deeply Christian,
Okay.
people found comfort and meaning in their faith attending church regularly.
Right.
But then this unimaginable horror struck, killing indiscriminately.
I could see how that would make people question everything they believed in.
Exactly. People were confronted with their own mortality in a way that they never had been before, and they struggled to understand why this was happening.
Yeah.
Some saw it as God's punishment for their sins.
Oh, wow.
And they turned to prayer, seeking forgiveness. There are even records showing that villagers pooled their resources
Wow.
to fund a statue of the Virgin Mary, hoping to appease God and gain protection.
So in the face of such immense suffering, people clung even tighter to their faith,
Yeah.
seeking solace and answers.
While others turned to superstition.
Ooh.
Desperate for a sense of control, they blamed bad smells, carried flowers, burned incense to ward off the evil air,
Wow.
and even practiced self-quarantine. But they didn't have a name for it back then.
Wow.
Imagine that, facing an invisible enemy with no scientific understanding of how it spreads.
Right.
It's no wonder people grasped for anything that might offer protection.
A mix of faith and fear driving people's actions.
Yeah.
But what about the church itself? How did they handle this crisis?
While many priests committed to their calling died caring for the sick,
Wow.
leaving people without spiritual guidance when they needed it most.
Oh, gosh.
And the church's inability to stop the plague, despite all the prayers and rituals, it really shook their authority.
Yeah.
If God is all-powerful and merciful, why was this happening?
Right.
It's a question that has resonated throughout history.
It's a question that forces us to consider the limits of faith and understanding,
Absolutely.
even in the face of unimaginable tragedy.
Yeah.
But let's delve deeper into how this spiritual crisis played out
Okay.
and what lasting impacts it had on Walsham and its people.
That's good.
I'll pick up right there after a short break.
Okay.
We've been talking about how the Black Death just completely transformed life in Walsham.
Yeah.
We've seen how it reshaped the economy, upended the social order, and shook people's faith just to the core.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's clear that Walsham was just forever changed by this devastating event.
Absolutely. And I think the key takeaway here is that the Black Death wasn't just a fleeting tragedy.
Right.
You know, its impact reverberated for generations, leaving an indelible mark on everything from land ownership to religious practices.
So let's dig a little deeper in some of those long-term consequences.
Okay.
We talked about how the labor shortage gave the peasants more bargaining power,
Right.
leading to better wages and working conditions.
Yeah.
Did those gains last?
Mm-hmm.
Or did the old order eventually reassert itself?
That's a great question, and it's one that historians are still debating.
Okay.
On one hand, the feudal system, which was already weakening, never fully recovered from the blow delivered by the Black Death.
Okay.
The demand for labor remained high, which gave peasants, continued leverage.
So they weren't forced back into subservience as soon as the plague subsided.
Not exactly. Wages remained higher than before the plague.
Wow.
And some peasants even managed to acquire land, moving up the social ladder.
So the Black Death, in a sense, opened the door to social change.
Precisely. It challenged the rigid hierarchy of feudalism,
Right.
and it demonstrated that a different social order was possible.
Wow.
However, this wasn't a sudden revolution.
Okay.
The transition was messy, it was gradual, and it was often met with resistance from those in power.
Of course, the lords weren't just going to give up their privileges without a fight.
Exactly. The Statute of Laborers, which we mentioned earlier, is a perfect example of that resistance.
Right.
It attempted to suppress wages and force laborers to accept the pre-plague conditions.
Right.
But as we discussed, it largely backfired, fueling resentment and unrest.
It seems like the Black Death unleashed forces that couldn't be easily contained.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the plague's impact on the landscape itself.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that land use changed with a greater emphasis on sheep grazing.
Right.
How did that reshape Walsham?
Well, it had a significant impact both physically and economically.
Okay.
With fewer people to feed, arable land used for crops was gradually converted to pasture land for sheep.
Okay.
This also had ecological consequences, changing the local plant and animal life.
So Walsham literally started to look different.
Yes, fields that once grew wheat and barley were now dotted with sheep.
Wow.
And economically, this shift to sheep farming had a ripple effect. Wool was in high demand, both domestically and for trade, which turned Walsham into a key player in this growing industry.
So the Black Death, in a way, inadvertently transformed Walsham into a center for wool production.
You could say that.
Wow.
It's a reminder that even in the wake of tragedy, innovation and adaptation can emerge,
Yeah.
shaping the destiny of a community.
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit.
Yeah.
But this focus on wool must have had social consequences as well.
Right.
Did everyone benefit equally from this new economic reality?
That's a really important question. And while wool production brought prosperity to some, it also widened the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
So for every Matthew Gilbert who climbed the social ladder, there were others who were left behind.
Unfortunately, yes, the demand for wool led to land consolidation.
Right.
Larger landowners, like our friend Matthew, acquired more land,
Right.
often at the expense of smaller farmers who struggled to compete.
That sounds a bit like some of the economic trends we see even today.
It's a recurring pattern throughout history. Wow.
And this consolidation of land ownership has significant social consequences.
Okay.
Some small farmers driven off their land moved to towns and cities in search of work,
Oh, wow.
which contributed to the growth of urban centers.
So the Black Death, in a way, fueled the early stages of urbanization.
It's all connected, you see.
Yeah.
Disease, economics, social structure, even the landscape, they all influence each other in complex ways.
It really makes you see history from a different perspective.
It does.
But let's get back to Walsham and the plague's lasting legacy.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like there's still much more to uncover.
There is. We've only touched upon how the Black Death reshaped Walsham's religious beliefs, practices, and even its artistic expressions.
Well, then let's dive back in after such a traumatic event. What happened to the people's faith? Did they find solace, or did the plague leave them disillusioned?
That's a great question, and one we'll explore as we continue to unravel the Black Death's impact on Walsham. Stay with us as we delve deeper into the enduring legacy of this transformative event in history. We've been exploring how the Black Death just utterly transformed Walsham.
Yeah.
We've seen how it reshaped the village's economy, upended the social order, and left people grappling with their faith.
Right.
Now let's dive into how this devastating event impacted the spiritual life of Walsham.
So, before the Black Death, the church was at the center of life in Walsham.
Okay.
It offered comfort, meaning, and a sense of order, in a world that often felt unpredictable.
Right.
Imagine it, the church bells, ringing people, gathering for services, seeking guidance and solace in their faith.
Right.
But then this unimaginable tragedy struck.
And as we discussed earlier, it really shook people's faith to the core.
Yeah.
Some saw the plague as divine punishment, turning to prayer and acts of penance. Others desperately clung to superstitions, hoping to ward off this invisible enemy.
Yeah, it's understandable, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Black Death forced people to confront their own mortality in a way they never had before. Right.
And they struggled to reconcile this devastating event with their belief in a loving and all-powerful God.
Yeah.
If God was merciful, why did he allow such suffering?
Right.
This question, echoing through the ages, really sparked a crisis of faith for many.
It must have been a time of immense anguish and confusion.
Yeah.
How did the church itself respond to this crisis?
Well, the church's response was complex.
Okay.
Many priests, true to their vows, bravely served the sick and dying,
Right.
often sacrificing their own lives in the process.
Wow.
Their selflessness offered comfort to some, but it also highlighted the limitations of the church.
Yeah.
If even the most devout couldn't escape the plague,
Right.
what hope was there for ordinary people?
It's a heartbreaking dilemma.
Yeah.
And one that likely fueled the doubts and questions people were already grappling with.
Right.
Did this crisis of faith lead to any lasting changes within the church?
It did. The Black Death exposed the church's vulnerabilities, both in terms of its earthly power.
And its ability to explain suffering in a way that made sense to people.
Right.
This led to calls for reform both from within the church
Okay.
and from those who felt disillusioned by its response to the plague.
So the seeds of religious change, at least in part, were sown by the Black Death.
Exactly. It's important to remember that this wasn't a sudden or immediate transformation,
Right.
but the plague's impact on religious beliefs and practices reverberated for generations,
Yeah.
contributing to the rise of new religious movements
Okay.
and eventually challenging the church's dominance.
It's a reminder that even the most deeply held beliefs can be profoundly affected by events of this magnitude.
Absolutely.
But amidst the death and despair, were there any glimmers of hope
Yeah.
that emerged from this spiritual crisis?
There were, and those glimmers often found expression through art and architecture.
Okay.
The immense loss and suffering caused by the plague led to a surge in religious art and architecture,
Okay.
as people sought solace and meaning in the face of death.
So they turned to artistic expression as a way to process their grief and find some sort of spiritual comfort.
Precisely, for example, people began constructing elaborate tombs and memorials
Okay.
as a way to honor the dead and express their hope for resurrection.
Wow.
Religious paintings and sculptures often depicted plague saints,
Okay.
interceding on behalf of the afflicted, offering a sense of hope and protection.
It's fascinating how art can reflect and respond to these profound societal upheavals.
Yeah.
It becomes a window into the hearts and minds of people grappling with unimaginable experiences.
And in Walsham, we see this reflected in the funding of that statue of the Virgin Mary we mentioned earlier.
Right.
It's a testament to their hope for divine intervention and a longing for protection in the face of so much death.
It's a poignant reminder that even in the darkest of times, human beings seek solace in beauty, faith, and the enduring power of the human spirit.
And that, I believe, is one of the most significant insights we can gain from this deep dive into the Black Death's impact on Walsham. This event brought unimaginable suffering and loss, but it also revealed the incredible resilience of the human spirit.
Right.
It showed our capacity for hope, adaptation, and change, even in the face of overwhelming tragedy.
It's a lesson that resonates deeply even centuries later.
It does.
So as we conclude our journey back to 14th century England,
Yeah.
let's carry with us not only the memory of the Black Death's horrors,
Right?
but also the enduring lessons it offers about the human condition,
Absolutely.
our capacity for immense suffering, and our extraordinary resilience.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of how disease can reshape societies, and a call to reflect on the importance of compassion, understanding, and the pursuit of knowledge in a world that continues to face challenges and uncertainties.
Well said. And as we consider how the Black Death transformed Walsham, perhaps we can each find renewed appreciation for the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing each moment.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Black Death's impact on Walsham. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the deeper meaning in the stories of the past.